Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we'll have another Sutta study. This morning we'll be looking at a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 8, Sutta number 76. This is called the Dutiya-Sampadā Sutta. So the word Sampada means accomplishment or perfection or attainment. So these are the 8 kinds of accomplishments or 8 kinds of attainments, 8 kinds of perfections. So this is kind of an interesting list here, in that here the Buddha seems to be talking primarily to lay people, and the advice he gives is more directly related to lay practitioners. So the Buddha begins. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the discourse. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So I'll start going through the discourse in Pali and giving some translation and explanation, and then I'll take any questions at the end. So the Buddha begins, Atima bhikkhave sampada. So there are these 8 kinds of sampada, these 8 kinds of accomplishment or attainment or perfection. And he says, Katama atta, what 8? Otana sampada, araka sampada, kalyana mittata, samajivata, Suddhaso, sila sampada, chaga sampada, panya sampada. So the first one, Otana Sampadā. So the Buddha says, Katamacha bhikkhave Otana Sampadā. So Otana comes from the verb tana, which literally means standing, and the prefix ud, which means up. So Otana literally means standing up or upstanding. But its applied sense means to take the initiative in something, or putting forth effort in something, or starting something, or applying oneself to something. So although again, the literal meaning is standing up, the applied meaning means to apply oneself to something. So commit to something. And the example here the Buddha gives, he says, what is Otana Sampadā? What is the accomplishment or perfection of initiative or of commitment? And he says, Ita bhikkhave kulaputto. So here, a gentleman or a good person, yena kammatanena jivatang kapeti. So by means of whatever kind of work, one makes a livelihood. And this is interesting on a linguistic point, by the way, is that this is one of the very few places in the suttas where the term kammatana appears. And the term kammatana here means the kind of job that you do, kind of work that you do, your livelihood, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the later commentarial usage of this term as meaning a meditation practice. So in the later apocryphal texts, the term kammatana came to mean a meditation technique. But in the suttas, the word kammatana means a job in the ordinary sense. So the Buddha says, whatever kind of job by means of which one makes a living. And he gives some examples. He says, yadi kasya. So for example, yadi kasya, yani vanijaya, yadi govrakena, yadi isatena, yadi rajaporasena, yadi sitpanyatarena. So whether it's by farming or cow herding or archery, or by government service, or by some kind of craft, some kind of craftsmanship. So basically whatever your job is. He says, tatadako hoti, so one is skilled in that. analaso, one is not lazy. And he says, tatrupayaya vimangsaya samanagato alankatung alangsangvidatunti. And he says, and one investigates that. So one takes it up as so one is constantly investigating what one is doing. One is paying attention and considering and reflecting upon one's craft, one's skill, one's work activities. So always trying to improve what one is doing, to do things correctly. And so the Buddha says, Yang Vuchati Bhikkhave Otana-Sampadā. So this is the perfection or accomplishment in initiative, in applying oneself. So basically he's saying whatever your job is, then to do so with skill and diligence, and to constantly try to improve your ability within that domain, constantly trying to improve your skill. The second one, he says, Katamacha bhikkhave araka-sampadā. So the term araka means to protect or to guard. So he's saying, what is the accomplishment of in guarding or protecting? And he says, ida bhikkhave kulaputtasa bhoga honti. So whatever kind of wealth a person has, Otana viryadigata, which has been attained through application of energy, so through applying oneself to one's job. And he uses here the same word Otana that he used for the first accomplishment. So Otana virya adigata. So what one is attained through energy in one's initiative, in one's work projects. It says Baha Balaparichita, so which has been done through the strength of one's arms. Seda Vakita, with this literally means with sweat dripping down. So again, the sense of like working hard, whatever wealth you've worked hard to achieve. And wealth which has been achieved, the Buddha says, Dhammika Dhammaladda. So in accordance with the Dhamma. So whatever you've gained in a manner in accordance with Dhamma. So this means doing a job which is harmless, and which doesn't involve breaking the precepts or taking advantage of people, or doing anything unwholesome or harmful in any way. So this is the basic principle of right livelihood, is whatever our job is, we want to try to find a job which is as harmless as possible, which doesn't harm other sentient beings, but which also doesn't harm ourselves, and which doesn't require us to break any precepts, tell any lies, do anything dishonest or anything harmful in any way. I would also add to this, by the way, that if you're working a job which is extremely stressful and agitating, that's also contrary to the principles of Dhamma. So that's another important thing to consider. So every now and then people will ask questions, like trying to decide what kind of work to do, or choosing between different ways of working. And often there's this question of like, well, this kind of job makes more money, but it's more stressful, it's more agitating, and leaves me worn out at the end of the day. This other job makes less money, but it's a bit more relaxed and low key. Well, then you should always go with the one that's a bit more relaxed, the one that at the end of your work, you can forget about your work and spend the rest of your time focusing on the development of the mind. So that's another very important element to consider with your work, is not just, is it a harmless livelihood? Is it something that is moral? But also, how is it affecting your own mind? Is it causing unnecessary stress or agitation or busyness in your own mind? And so whatever kind of wealth, so the Buddha says, whatever kind of wealth you get through applying yourself to your work in a way in accordance with Dhamma, he says, te arakena Dutiya-Sampadā. So one tries to protect it well. And he gives the example of a person thinking, Kinti me boge, how can my wealth, neva rajano harayang, not be taken away by the government, Na chora hareyang, not be taken away by thieves. Na agi daya, not be burned by fire. Na urakang vaheya, not be damaged by water. Na apya daya da hareyunti, and not be taken away by unloved benefactors. And he says, Ayang Vuchati Bhikkhave Araka Sampada. This is the accomplishment or the perfection of guarding. So here the Buddha is saying to be careful with whatever wealth or possessions that we accumulate, to be careful that it doesn't get damaged or destroyed or stolen or lost, but making sure that whatever we've worked for, that we actually make sure that it's not wasted, but that we take care of things properly. I always found this line, na apya dayada hareyunti, very amusing. This line, and not let it be taken away by unloved heirs. So it's like the daughter gets the money, but not the son. I don't like the son. But more, I think the Buddha's point here is more considering. It's like, well, okay, if this person takes the wealth, then they're going to use it inappropriately. They're going to use it for unwholesome purposes, or they're going to be wasteful with it. Whereas this other person will use it in accordance with Dhamma. They'll use it for good things. They'll use it wisely. So that's more the consideration. Next he says, Katamachi bhikkhave kalyana mittata. So kalyana mittata. So this comes from the word kalyana, which literally it means beautiful, but it also has the meaning of someone with good spiritual qualities. And mitta, which means friend. So kalyana mitta is a good spiritual friend, a friend that has good spiritual qualities and that supports you in your own practice. And in many places in the suttas, the Buddha talks about the importance of kalyana mittata, the importance of having good spiritual friends who are similarly committed to following the Buddhist path, or through, even if they're not Buddhist, if they're at least committed to principles of morality, principles of good conduct. Because we're strongly influenced by the people that we're around. We're strongly influenced by the people that we spend time with. So the Buddha puts a big importance on really carefully considering who we spend time with and how it affects us, how it affects our moral and spiritual development. So the Buddha here explains this. He says, Iti bhikkhave kulaputto. So here a person, yasmin game va nigame va patibasati, in whatever village or town they live in, tatayete honti gahapati va gahapati puttava. So whatever people there are there, so whether householders or the children of householders, and he says, Daharava vuddhasilino, vuddhava vuddhasilino. So this I find interesting. So Dahara means young, and Vuddha means old. So whether they're young or old, but for both of these, he says, vuddhasilino, which means having the behavior of an elder. So whether it's a young person who's very mature or an old person who's very mature. So here the Buddha is saying not to make a distinction based upon the age of a person, but rather looking at their maturity, looking at their level of spiritual development in particular, which are the next qualities he gives. He says, Dutiya-Sampadā, so someone who has an accomplishment in faith, so strong confidence in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Sila-Sampadā, so accomplishment in virtue. Chaga-Sampadā, accomplishment in generosity and letting go. And Panya-Sampadā, so accomplishment in wisdom. So again, whether somebody is young or old, if they have strong faith, strong virtue, strong generosity, and strong wisdom, then the Buddha says, Tehi sading santitati sanlapati sakachang samapajati. He says, you should stay together with that kind of person. You should talk with them. You should have conversation with them. Yatharupanang saddha sampannanang saddha sampadang anusikati. So he says, In doing so, then you will train in accordance with their perfection of faith. Yatharupanang sila sampannanang sila sampadang anusikati. You'll train in accordance with their perfection of sila, with their virtue. Yatharupanang chaga sampannanang chaga sampadang anusikati. You'll train in accordance with their perfection of generosity. Yatharupanang panya sampannanang panya sampadang anusikati. And you'll train in accordance with their wisdom. So here again, the Buddha is pointing to this fact that if you spend time with people who are good spiritual practitioners with wholesome qualities well developed, then you'll tend to also grow in those same qualities. So you watch their example, you talk to them, you ask them about their practice, and then you train yourself in following their example. So he says, Ayang vochadi bhikkhave kalyana mittata. So he says, this is what's called the good spiritual friendship. The next one, he says, Katamacha bhikkhave samajivata. So what is samajivata? So the word sama has a few different meanings. So one meaning it has is balanced or harmonious. It also has the meaning of peaceful, by the way, but that doesn't seem to be relevant in this particular case. But the main meaning here is balanced or appropriate. And jivata means how one lives, one's livelihood. So having a balanced or appropriate way of living. And he says, Ida bhikkhave kulaputo ayancha boganang viditva, vayancha boganang viditva, samang jivakang kapeti. So he says, here a person knows what the accumulation of wealth is and knows what the loss of wealth is, and tries to live in a balanced way. He says, nacho galhang. So acho galhang means diving in too deeply. That's literally what it means. And natihinang. So atihina means excessively little. So he's saying not overexpending, but also not being too stingy. So not just wildly flinging yourself into spending as much as you want, but also not just constantly saving up all your wealth and never using it for anything. And he says, so one should consider, evang me ayo vayang parayadaya tasati. So just check how Bhikkhu Bodhi translates this. Okay. So he says, Evang me ayo vayang parayadaya tasati, nacha me vayo ayang parayadaya tasati. So he says, may my income exceed my expenditure, and may my expenditure not exceed my income. So a basic consideration, don't spend more than you make, which would be very disappointing to credit card companies. But this is a very basic principle the Buddha is giving is, well, first off, just be careful that you're not bankrupting yourself. So don't spend more than you actually make. And he gives the example, he says, Seyatapi bhikkhave tuladaro va tuladarante vasiva. So here the example of a weigher, so someone who weighs things. Tulang pagahetva janati, so takes their weights and understands. Etikenava onatang, etikenava onatanti. They understand in this much there's too little, or in this way there's too much. So they can weigh things and understand which one is heavier and which one is lighter. So it's always trying to understand how things balance out. He says, Evam evam ko bhikkhave kulaputo ayancha boganang viditva, vayancha boganang viditva. So in the same way one understands, and he gives the same thing he said before. So understanding how one accumulates wealth, how one loses wealth, and one doesn't live either too excessively or too frugally. And he says, Sachayang bhikkhave kulaputo apayo samano ularang jivakang kapeti. He says, monks, if there's a person who is poor but lives an extravagant lifestyle, says, Tassa bhavanti vataro. He says, of that person, people will say, Urumbara kadi vayang kulaputo boge kadati. Says, this person devours wealth as though they were devouring figs, which I find a kind of peculiar metaphor here. So I think of someone just like stuffing figs in their face, but maybe because I don't grow in a country where I don't live in a country where figs grow, I don't associate devouring figs with wasting money. So maybe this was a well-known saying at the time of the Buddha. But the point is someone who is living beyond their means, as they say. And the opposite extreme, he says, Sache panayang bhikve kulaputo mahayo samano kasarang jivakang kapeti. Says on the other extreme, you have someone who has a lot of wealth, but they live a very miserable lifestyle. So this is the kind of person who has maybe a lot of money in the bank, but they never use it for anything, and they live in an extremely, they live as though they were poor. And it says, Tassa bhavanti vataro. So he says, and of this person they'll say, Ajeta maranang vayang kulaputo marisati. And so the Buddhist statement here, Ajeta maranang vayang kulaputo marisati, it's actually before this live stream, I was looking this up because it's kind of an odd turn of phrase. So ajeta maranang, the most straightforward meaning of this would mean one who dies young. So saying this person will die young, or as though they're dying young. But it's a bit hard to see how that relates to what's being said here previously. So Bhikkhu Bodhi had translated this line as, this person may even starve himself, which is an interesting phrase, but doesn't seem to have anything to do with what's written in the Pali text. Bhante Suddhāso similarly said, this gentleman is starving themselves to death, which again is interesting, but doesn't seem to have anything to do with what's written in the Pali text. There's another way. What have we talked about before? There was another way of understanding this phrase.
There's the respect one.
This person is dying an unrespectable death. Actually, that has a certain sense to it. Yeah, you have something on your mind?
It's not to do with the text, but it feels like that phrase, like people who live like there's no tomorrow, like that's what came to mind.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It was like time with the death,
Well, I think that's in the opposite extreme, though. That's more like someone who lives an excessively luxuriant lifestyle. So here I think it's maybe what the Buddha is pointing to is that this is someone who they're basically acting as though they're already dead. Like they have wealth, but they're not using it. So it's like, why do they even have it? What good is it doing anyone? It's not helping them, and it's not helping anybody else.
Yeah, quickly, I was thinking maybe it's starving because the metaphor before is eating figs. So they're eating, so then they don't eat it all. Maybe that's where they get the starving from.
Again, which I get, it just doesn't seem to have anything to do with the Pali phrase. Anyway, but again, the point here is that the Buddha is making is, again, what's the point of wealth if it's not being put to any good purpose? Elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha talks about the proper use of wealth. And he says that the first use of wealth is to take care of yourself and your family. The next use of wealth is to donate to spiritual practitioners, so donating to contemplatives and priests, and then donating to society, so supporting both your local society and also on larger scales as well. So again, if money is just sitting in the bank and not going to any good use, then again, there's this question of is it actually fulfilling its purpose? So instead, the Buddha is saying we should always be considering how can I put my wealth to use in a beneficial way, in a way that helps people, in a way that helps, at a bare minimum, helps your own family, and optimally also that helps the spiritual betterment of society through supporting spiritual practitioners, and also supporting charitable endeavors, charitable projects. And I've known people who they were getting into their old age and were actually really struggling with their health and struggling with different problems in their life. But they weren't willing to use the money that they had in order to take care of themselves better. But they also weren't willing to put it to use in bettering society or helping their family or anything. It just sits in the bank until they die. So it's the Buddha's kind of pointing to this. He's like, well, what are we actually doing? Is our problem that we're too luxurious to the point where we're driving ourselves bankrupt? Or are we too stingy to the point where whatever wealth we've accumulated is not going to anybody's benefit? Where we're living a painful and uncomfortable life because we're not willing to spend it on ourselves. But also we're not willing to donate it to any kind of worthy cause either. So this is balanced livelihood. It's balancing one's income and one's expenditure in a way which is supportive and helpful to the people affected. So again, this is part of what's interesting about this particular sutta, is that the Buddha is actually focusing on giving financial advice to lay people, which is not something that we see in very many places in the Pali Canon. And then the next four sampadas, these are things which are a bit more familiar because we see them in many places in the suttas. He says, Katamachi bhikkhave Suddha-Sampadā. So what is the accomplishment in faith? It says, Ida bhikkhave kulaputto saddho hoti, sadhati tathagata saboding. So he says, here a person has faith in the awakening of the Tathagata. So in other words, somebody has faith that the Buddha was in fact an enlightened being. And he gives an example of the recollection of the Buddha that we normally do every day in the monastery. Tipiso bhagava arahang samma sambuddho, etc. So the Bhagava is the fully awakened one, and going through the 9 qualities of the Buddha. He says, Ayang vochati bhikkhave Suddha-Sampadā. This is the accomplishment in faith. Next he says, Katamachi bhikkhave Sila-Sampadā. What is the accomplishment in virtue? He says, Ida bhikkhave kulaputto panatipata virato hoti. So one abstains from killing, and he goes through the 5 precepts. So panatipata vairamani, so abstaining from killing living beings. Adinadana vairamani, refraining from stealing, from taking things that aren't ours, that aren't given to us. Kamesumechachara vairamani, so refraining from sexual misconduct, which means breaking the trust boundaries in our sexual relationships. Musavada vairamani, which means not telling lies, refraining from lying. And Sura Mereya Majjapamadatthana vairamani, which means refraining from using alcohol or any intoxicant that weakens our mindfulness, anything that produces negligence. He says this is the perfection of virtue. So it's following the 5 precepts. This is the basic level of virtue that we try to practice. Next he says, Katamacha bhikkhave Chaga-Sampadā. What is the accomplishment in generosity? So the word chaga, by the way, has 2 meanings. One is generosity and the other is letting go. So depending on the context, you'll see it used in either way. Here it's used in the sense of generosity. I'm just going to briefly look up this term. So this term shows up in a number of places, and the Buddha says, I'm just looking this up because right here in this particular sutta, it has the abbreviated form. So I need to find where it has the full one. Here we go. He says, Vigata mala mache rena. So this means without being stained by stinginess. Cetasa agarang ajavaseya. So one lives the household life with a mind not stained by stinginess. Muttachago payatapani. So one who gives freely with an open hand. So payatapani means an open hand. Vosagareto, so one who delights in relinquishing. Yacha yogo, one who is committed to giving, to offering. Dana Sangvibhagarito, one who delights in giving and sharing. So this is the perfection of generosity. One who, and I particularly like, again, Payatapani, so open-handed. And Dana Sangvibhagarito, one who delights in sharing, one who delights in giving and sharing. So this is the perfection of generosity. And then the last one, Katamacha Bhikkhave Dutiya-Sampadā. What is the perfection of wisdom, the accomplishment in wisdom? And he says, again, it's elided in this text, so just give me a moment to pull up the full version of this. So for those who think the Pali texts are too repetitive, you should see what they would look like if they didn't elide things all over the place. Here we go. So one is Panyava. So one is wise. Udiyatigamaniya panyaya samanagato. So endowed with the wisdom that knows arising and disappearing. So udaya means arising and atagamani means disappearing. So recognizing arising and ceasing. This means developing the recognition of impermanence. So observing the constant change in all aspects of our experience. Aryaya nibbedikaya sammadukkha kaya gamaniya. So which leads to the noble breakthrough to the complete elimination of suffering. So this is what he defines as wisdom. It's cultivating the perception of impermanence, because through cultivating the perception of impermanence, one can recognize the nature of dukkha. One can recognize that one of the primary causes of our suffering is taking that which is impermanent as though it was permanent. So treating this body-mind as a permanent, stable, ongoing entity when it isn't. So treating whatever pleasant experience we're craving as reliable when it isn't. Treating whatever unpleasant thing we're hating as permanent when it isn't. So cultivating the perception of impermanence then, in many places in the suttas, the Buddha identifies as being the critical basis of wisdom. So this is another example of that. And he says, Eyang Vucchati Bhikkhave Dutiya-Sampadā. So this is the accomplishment in wisdom. So those are the 8 accomplishments. So again, that's Otana-Sampadā, which is the accomplishment in initiative. So making an effort to do well at your job. Araka-Sampadā, the accomplishment of protection, which means protecting your wealth, so not letting it be wasted or lost or stolen. Kalyana Mittata, which means good spiritual friendship, so associating with people who have good qualities, so faith, virtue, generosity, and wisdom. Samajivata means living in a balanced way, so not being either too excessive in one's spending, but also not being too stingy. And then accomplishment in faith, so having faith in the Buddha's awakening. Accomplishment in virtue, following the 5 precepts. Accomplishment in generosity, so being committed to sharing what we have with others. So elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha says, even to the extent of sharing the food that you have in your bowl. Another term I find really delightful. So even if all you have is some food in your bowl, you should still think about sharing it with somebody else. And Panya-Sampadā, the accomplishment of wisdom, which is the direct perception of impermanence. So that's the end of the sutta. After this, there's a short poem, but I'm going to skip it because it doesn't really add anything in particular to the text. So I think we can go ahead and respect the sutta with 3 sadhus.
Chandayang Dhammagadhaya Sadhukarang Dadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. And at this time, if there's any questions or comments, I can take some questions or comments. And hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to John, Kit, Usha, Jayanta, Manal, Douglas, Jeff, Lo, Let It Go, Let It Be, Sud, Vo Van Pook, Jessica, Hasanta, and Bhumika. Welcome, all of you. And I don't see any questions online. Are there any questions from the monastery residents? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say I saw the starving thing. It's actually in the notes. You want to go over it later or now?
Yeah, let's talk about it later. Yeah, go ahead.
So I noticed in the beginning you were mentioning how the Buddha said that like one of the things as like one of the things that is kind of like a wholesome job is like cow herding. What is that? And like is that what I was understanding?
No, he was just giving an example of different common livelihoods at the time. Keeping in mind that up until very recently, the majority of people were doing some kind of farming as their livelihood. So subsistence farming has been the main occupation of humanity for thousands of years. It's only very recently that that's changed. So he's just giving an example of different kinds of farming, different ways of producing food. It's not saying that cow herding is in and of itself a wholesome livelihood, because that's actually questionable. But he's just giving it as an example of a common job that people would do.
Okay. I was confused about that. Thank you. I also did have another question. You mentioned if one is living beyond their means, that's not like it's not a wholesome way of living, and having a lot of wealth but not living, as if they are poor. So were you trying, like, was that basically like going to either extremes, like for both of those?
Yeah. So I mean, one thing that an example of this that I remember is I used to see this a lot in the neighborhood where I grew up. Is you would see these like very small rundown houses with like badly kept yard, like messy, like everything, like houses kind of in disarray. And then there's this really expensive brand new car parked in the driveway. And it's just like, what on earth is going on here? Did they just spend like every single bit of money they had just on the car and they're ignoring everything else? Seems a little bit strange. So I used to see that a lot, and I always found that a bit peculiar. So, or people who, again, they just love shopping and they just keep getting more credit cards and shopping and building up more and more debt because they want to accumulate stuff beyond what they actually earn. So that's more what the Buddha is pointing to here, I think. He's talking about someone whose greed for stuff exceeds what they're actually capable of affording. And actually in modern American culture, this is really easy. It's really easy to accumulate huge amounts of debt where you're just buried under it for decades. Of course, in the time of the Buddha, you could actually go to jail for these things. Like if your debt exceeded your income, you could go to jail. That's actually been the case throughout most of human history. You could go to jail for having too much debt. Seems a bit counterproductive because then there's no way you can pay off your debt. But this is how things worked in much of the world until very recently. Yeah, and then the opposite extreme. So again, people who, they just put all the money in the bank, but they never actually use it for anything. So the Buddha said that whatever wealth we accumulate, we should use it to, 1, take care of ourselves, 2, take care of our family, 3, take care of the religious people that we know, the contemplatives and priests, and 4, to contribute to society, so donating to charity and supporting the broader society. So if instead you just stake your money in the bank and just let it rot there. It's like, well, that's not doing anybody any good. So again, if you're not even taking care of yourself, let alone helping your family or your society, then the money's not going to any good. It's pointless. That's what he's talking about here.
Okay. I just want to add on to that. What about like when it comes to like savings or investments? Because I read like in one of the books that like the Buddha has mentioned like to leave a portion for savings, like for just in case. Like how does that work?
Yeah, that's in another sutta, and I don't remember the details. I'd have to look it up. And I mean, I've been a monk for my entire adult life, so when it comes to financial matters, I can't actually say anything concrete or specific.
Yeah.
I mean, my approach is actually to use it all with the trust that something's going to come your way in the future. So I have more faith in investment in good karma than investment in stocks or whatever people invest in. So my thought is usually more like, oh, you have extra? Great, donate it to something wholesome. Contribute, cultivate good karma, invest in good karma.
Thank you. That
Yeah.
really helps.
I was struck when you just made the comment about, that the Buddha is giving financial advice, and I was just reflecting a little bit broadly in the sense of, so I just want to state this and see if it makes sense and if there are any other implications or not. But it felt a little bit like the first part, like from livelihood to the financial advice and balance. It feels a little bit like the umbrella for that might be sort of how we spend our energy in the fruit of that energy, versus the second part seem to be qualities, wisdom, etc. And I was just thinking about that because, like you said, it's financial advice, but it feels like it maybe fits within that like benefit of where my energy has been spent, and if that A makes sense, and B, if there are any implications of that I might not be. I'm just percolating a little bit, so I'm sorry it's a little nebulous.
Well, I think like here, there's also a bit of a progression that's happening. So again, similar to what we see in places like the Mangala Sutta, where the Buddha's like clearly starting from more like coarse, ordinary, worldly kinds of benefits, and then gradually progressing towards more spiritual benefits until finally he ends with awakening as the highest blessing. So similarly here, I think he's starting with very simple things. He's like, oh, you want to know about accomplishments? Okay, well, one accomplishment is to be really good at your job. That's an example of an accomplishment. And then another accomplishment is protecting the wealth that you get. That's another kind of accomplishment. And then he works his way up until he's talking about accomplishment in wisdom as the final one. So it's, again, there's this sense of progression starting from the most like coarse, basic, worldly kind of accomplishments and leading up to accomplishment in wisdom as being the highest. And that's a sequence that we see in many places in the suttas. So that might be part of what he's doing here. You have a question?
Thank you. So I have a question about the first one, about being very good at your job.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that, but back in the day, just like you said, up until somewhat very recently, people didn't really have a choice. They were born into doing certain things. If you were like part of a farming family or like a family that dealt with animals, and so people kind of like stuck with that. And so these days, people definitely have way more choice when it comes to what they want to do. And so I guess my question is, does Buddha talk about, how to make that choice, because a lot of, sometimes today you hear a lot about how, you should really love what you do to be really good at it. So is it really like or like on what base, I guess, should you commit to a certain kind of like activity? Because, now we're not born into it. Well, I mean, technically we have a choice. So is there like any, I guess, premises based on which you should make that choice?
Yeah, well, I mean, the number one consideration is always what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. So that's our number one consideration. So it's a good thing that these days, most people have, at least in advanced countries, most people have a lot of choices in terms of what kind of livelihood they have, what kind of work they do. So the first thing is always what is wholesome, what doesn't harm any sentient beings. And optimally, what's a livelihood which is beneficial, which brings some benefit to sentient beings. You also want to consider what, as I was mentioning earlier, what also supports your own mental and spiritual well-being. Mm-hmm. So actually, as an example, I knew someone who they were actually working a very wholesome job. It was working in some kind of social justice related field. I forget the exact details. But the job itself was working very long hours. It was very stressful. The person was having a lot of mental and emotional disturbances just because of how stressful and difficult the working environment was. So it's well, okay, you're doing something which is helping other people. That's good. But it's also harming at least one person, you. So in that case, it's actually possibly not right livelihood. You might be helping other people, but in the process, you're harming yourself. That's not necessarily the right way to live your life. So that's also an important consideration, is how is your job affecting you? And that's where the question of doing what you love becomes relevant, is that if you're trying to force yourself to do a job which you actually really hate doing and which makes you depressed or irritable or anxious, or which causes a lot of emotional turbulence for you, or which makes your mind very agitated and messy, and then it's really hard for you to get your mind to quiet down after work, or something where it really sticks in your heart and you're constantly fretting about it, well, then maybe that's really not good. Maybe that's really not good for you. Maybe you should do something else. So on the other hand, if you have a job which, actually optimally, a job which is peaceful, a job which you can do with a quiet mind, raking leaves, sweeping paths, simple things. So things you can do that don't stir up the mind, and things you can do which don't disturb your heart. These are ideal. So, and again, when you have very limited work occupations, then you just do the best you can within the limited choices that you have. But when you have a lot of choices, then you actually get the opportunity to really consider what actually is supportive both to my own well-being and also to the well-being of others. And so this can be a real question to examine. And the question of how much money does it produce is at the absolute bottom of the list. It's the least relevant question. It's actually basically irrelevant unless for some reason you have really high expenses for good reasons. But for most people, they actually don't need very much money. It's more that they want things, but not what they need. Does that answer that question? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, just a little follow-up. So because where's that line between, because I was raised to sometimes you have to do what you have to do. Most of the times you have to do what you have to do regardless of how you feel about it. So is it even ever worth making yourself do things for higher reasons, providing for yourself and your family, or if there's a job that you're you dread doing, you're oh my God, I'm only gonna go and do it for money. Is it because then one part, I'm specifically talking about me, one part of me can be I really, really do not want to go there, and the other part, but you have to. And then if I don't go, I feel guilty that I didn't go. But part of me feels guilty, and part of me feels relieved that I didn't do the thing that I hated, that I would have hated. So do I have to, I guess the question is, do you have to sometimes make yourself do things?
Well, that's a very, very broad question. So,
well, in terms of your job.
Well, again, I would always say consider your options, and always consider if there's other options that you're not aware of. So sometimes we get this very narrow view of thinking I have to do this and only this, but actually we have a huge field We're just not recognizing how big a field of options we have. And as far as forcing yourself to do something that you don't want to do, well, it's good to examine why are you resistant to doing that particular thing. Is it just because you're feeling lazy that day? Is it that there's some minor defilement in operation that you can work against? So for example, here at the monastery, maybe you get assigned to clean the toilets and you're like, well, I really hate cleaning toilets. I don't want to do this. Well, okay, get over it and go clean the toilets and use that as an opportunity to get over your aversion to cleaning toilets. I've scrubbed many, many, many toilets in my monastic life, and it turns out it's totally fine. In the very beginning, I was actually kind of like, ugh. But now it's like, okay, here we go, another toilet to clean. So
actually have no problem with toilets.
Great, that's good.
I think it's the people. I'll choose a toilet over some people every day. That's another sign of something, I guess.
Well, in monasteries, you have to deal with both toilets and people. So you need to learn how to keep a peaceful mind when dealing with either one.
I think cleaning toilets is a good practice though, because it reminds you of like what we actually consume and like where it goes.
Yeah.
And like, yeah.
Yep, there's all that delicious food smeared on the side of the toilet. So, but yeah, I mean, as far as a job, so again, if we're actually really dreading our job because we recognize that it makes our mind messy or disturbed, well, maybe that's actually telling us something. Or if we're dreading our job because we always feel worn out and drained afterwards, maybe that's telling us something. Or maybe we don't feel good about our job because we have a sense that it's actually causing harm in the world. Maybe that's telling us something. Sorry, I had a friend who used to work in advertising for a major corporation, and at some point they just realized, oh, I'm contributing to all the problems that we're seeing in the world. They recognized I'm part of the problem. And then they quit their job because they realized I can't do that sort of thing anymore. So again, it's good to look, what is the resistance? Is the resistance just the whole like, well, I don't want to clean the toilets thing? Or is the resistance some kind of subconscious reaction to awareness that you're actually doing something harmful to yourself or to others? So that's why I say look a bit more deeply.
Thank you.
Yeah, because it isn't actually always the right option to just kind of force yourself to do things that you hate. That isn't always the right choice. Sometimes it is, but it isn't always. Oh. You had a question? No? Yeah, go ahead.
Another question about doing a good job in your livelihood. Sometimes, oftentimes, you have to work with other people in teams, all working toward the same goal, and the efforts that are put in by different members of the team are not always aligned. And if you find that in order to do the job well, be diligent, create a good product in a wholesome livelihood, actually, putting in that extra effort that creates the stress and agitation is sometimes necessary to pick up the slack, so to say. Is it better to protect your own ease and peacefulness, or is it better to put in that extra effort to pick up the slack in order to accomplish a better outcome?
Well, I think, again, you need to consider for yourself. Well, first off, recognizing that you can't control other people and that you're not responsible for other people's choices. So ultimately, you're only responsible for your own choices. So actually, one completely reasonable thing is For example, if there's 10 people working on a project and you feel like you've successfully done 1/10 of what needs to be done, you're like, okay, I did my part. And if the other people are slacking off and the final result isn't that good, well, it's not my fault. I did my 1/10 of the project. And if the others did less than 1/10, well, that's their karma that they're making. It's not mine. That's one perfectly reasonable answer. If you're committed to getting a good end result for the project and you want to put in extra effort and you feel good about putting in extra effort, that's also fine. But if it's something that you feel it just makes you over agitated, or it stresses you out, or it makes you exhausted, then yeah, I would say you can just rest easy in knowing that you did what you were responsible for doing, and the other people are responsible for their own bit, and either they step up to that or they don't. And sometimes you can tell other people, like gently pointing out to them that they could do a bit more. But sometimes you recognize you're not going to get anywhere with saying something like that. So you just let them see for themselves. Yeah, remembering ultimately you're only responsible for your own conduct. Other people make their own choices and deal with the consequences of their own choices. Okay. There's some questions online. Allison says, are the other two of the three characteristics part of the accomplishment of wisdom? So, anicca is mentioned in the form of knowing arising and ceasing. Dukkha is mentioned in terms of knowing the path which leads to the ending of dukkha. So it's only anatta that isn't specifically mentioned in the accomplishment of wisdom. However, anatta arises naturally from a deep investigation of anicca, because we see that also what we identify as self is also impermanent and insubstantial, and therefore has no lasting substance to it, and therefore can't be self. So although anicca and dukkha are mentioned and anatta is not mentioned, it is implied by anicca. And Faze has an off-topic question, which you can bring that to Monk Chat on Friday evenings. And Kit says, I've seen multiple people who have lost their previous level of wealth withdraw from life. They stop seeing life worth living if they can't live like they used to. Yeah, this is what happens usually when people don't have a spiritual practice. So people who are committed to materialism, when their level of material wealth diminishes, they can become very depressed because they don't have a higher purpose in their life. So I've actually seen this as well. And yeah, again, it points to the lack of solace in materialism. So actually, I've noticed that materialists, they tend to have just as much religious fervor and dedication as any other kind of religious person. It's just that their religion has no solace, it has no comfort. It's very unreliable. And in the end, you get sick and die anyway. And all that wealth didn't help you. So yeah, I mean, again, the problem here is a lack of spiritual practice. People with a strong spiritual practice, whether they make a lot of money or a little money, it doesn't affect them. They just keep cultivating a happy mind, a peaceful mind, a loving mind. And whether they have a lot or a little doesn't affect them one way or the other. Jeff says, how about financial planning, hoarding up a wealth to prepare for possible worst scenarios in old age? Well, as Henry pointed out, there is another sutta where the Buddha talks about saving a little bit for unforeseen circumstances. But here also, in this sutta, the Buddha is talking also about the dangers of just stockpiling wealth and never using it for anything. So, and he doesn't give specific percentages. So you kind of need to use your own judgment to figure out what's the right amount to save for potential disasters, and commit the rest to putting it to good use here and now. So again, as a monk, my net worth is 0. So I just don't think about saving at all because I don't. So to me, I'm always all in on everything all the time, which is delightful, I have to say. It's a really great way to live your life. And Daniel says, I find that I often take up too many duties and responsibilities, thinking that I will be generous in doing so. When I recognize this and hold back, I feel guilty. How can I fix this? Well, I personally never feel guilty about anything, ever. So if I recognize I've done something inappropriate, then it's like, well, of course I did something inappropriate. I'm an unenlightened being. And my mind doesn't always see things clearly, and I'm not always in a perfectly wholesome state of mind. So sometimes I do things which aren't so great. But when I recognize that, I have a commitment to doing better in the future. And that's what's really important. It's that commitment to trying to do better in the future. And as for taking on too many duties and responsibilities, well, as you've probably noticed, when we take on too much, then we're not able to give the proper amount of attention and care to what we have. So if you have, say, 100 units of energy, and each project takes 10 units of energy, then that means you can't do more than 10 projects. If you try to take on 20 projects, then you just won't have enough energy to do all of them properly. You'll just do a half-measure job on all of them. So of course, that's going to be insufficient. So instead, just recognize I'm going to do 10 duties really well. Rather than doing 20 duties poorly, I'm going to do 10 really well and delight in the fact that I'm doing 10 really well. And then in the future, when I have more resources or more energy or more resilience, then maybe I can do more than 10. But right now, that's what I'm able to do. So delight in what you're currently capable of doing, not in what you wish you could be capable of doing. So actually, maybe you can only do one thing, and that's actually great that you can do one thing. Delight in the fact that you can do one thing. Yeah, and constantly remind yourself of the good that you do, rather than thinking about the good that you're not doing, because that list will always be extremely long. Instead, think about the good that you are doing. Even if that list is only one item long, remind yourself of that one item. Take joy in that one item. Many people, they don't even have one item on their list of good things they're doing. So be joyful that you have at least one item. And whatever Slav says, AI will make most people jobless and thus homeless and suffering, especially the vulnerable. You know, not everything is a doomsday scenario. So I don't know much about the current state of AI. So I don't know if it's actually going to make everyone homeless and suffering. It's possible. I mean, realistically, everything's going to hell sooner or later. So it's possible, but I wouldn't jump too quickly into assuming that AI is going to make everybody jobless, homeless, and suffering in the immediate future. But as for allowing for spiritual practice, generally speaking, I'm a fan of things that allow for spiritual practice. So actually, if we moved into some kind of AI-based social utopia where nobody had to work and we all just had time to meditate, that would be awesome. Yeah, I'd be totally on board with that. And that's the last of the questions. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, Bhante. I wanted to actually ask about like what Amy had asked before, like to the scenario that you mentioned. So what if in a case where like the person is participating in the project and like they're doing their part, but like the other people aren't, and like it's kind of like a situation where it's like, oh, like their job is kind of in jeopardy if like they don't have it complete, like the entire project complete.
Give up, walk away, quit your job.
So then what if it affects like the livelihood or like if they have a family, like kids to take care of?
Do something else. So this is one of the things where at some point you just have to recognize I cannot control other people. And so when things get to a point where other people are acting in a way that's jeopardizing your job, well, then sometimes you just need to recognize these conditions are not workable anymore, and I need to go and do something different. You can't do the job of 10 people all by yourself. So if the other people are not holding up their side, then you just need to recognize this isn't happening, and you walk away. And actually, sometimes when you step away from something, that's when everybody else realizes how much you were doing in the first place.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was like kind of confused on that point. But I did have like 2 other questions.
So we should end. We're well past 9 o'clock, so you can ask your questions later.
Okay.
So we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.